Excellencies, Professor Schwab, ladies and gentlemen, and our audience online, welcome and thank you for joining us. I'm Mina Al-Uraibi. I'm Editor-in-Chief of The National here in the UAE, and I'm also an old, young global leader of the World Economic Forum. It's very moving to see people congregated once again in person, and we thank the World Economic Forum and the government of the UAE for bringing us together. We have an incredible panel today. We're talking about the next 50 years. All of us are questioning what the future will be like. And really, no better place to do it than in Dubai, which truly is the city of the future that we're living today. There have been difficult times that all of us lived through with the pandemic, and lessons learned also. In the UAE, there were certainly lessons learned, but also a quick reaction, an agile reaction to a very fast-moving situation. And so today, we'll try to talk about what lessons were learned, not only in the last 2 years, but in the 50 years of the UAE's formation. We will be celebrating the Jubilee of the UAE in just a few days in December, and we're looking to what the next 50 years will bring. The titles of my panelists, who are all members of government in the UAE, speak for themselves in how forward-thinking the government here is. And these titles are also telling of the change and the speed of change that we're witnessing around the world. So I will start with Her Excellency Minister Ahoud Al-Moumi, who's Minister of State for Government Development and the Future. Minister Sara Al-Amiri is Minister of State for Advanced Technology and from the Ministry of Industry and Advanced Technology. Minister Omar Al-Ulama, Minister of State for AI, Digital Economy, and Remote Work Application. And we have with us Minister Shamal Mazrou'i, Minister of State for Youth. So we want to talk about all these different elements and the portfolios that the ministers oversee. But I also want to talk about the past very briefly. And I'm going to ask a question that may seem like an impossible question, but in the UAE, the motto is, impossible is possible. So I'm going to ask each of you to kindly tell us in one word how you would describe the UAE's past 50 years. So, Minister Ahoud.
First of all, thank you, Mina. It's a great pleasure to be among some of the brightest minds and enlightened souls that contribute to the great narrative of the world. My word would be possibilities. You said it. In Arabic, we say la shay mustahil. So we don't have the word impossible in our dictionary in the UAE. We were blessed with wise leadership, vision, and willpower. We imagined the future, we designed it, and we executed, and you can see it visible around you.
Thank you. Minister Sara.
So good afternoon to everyone. I'll use hyphenated words. But a state of motion is what I would remark on the last 50 years, and that's the continuous growth that the country has gone on, and the continuous state of movement without staggering or pausing for a moment. That's what the UAE is about, because we've had to grow in such an exponential rate over the course of the last 50 years.
Thank you. Minister Amr.
Thank you very much. It's an absolute pleasure being with all of you today. I would use the word ineffable. And just for those who English is not the first language for, ineffable means something that is beyond description. And I think what we've seen from the human journey, what we've seen from the economic, from the development journey of the UAE, and also what we've seen with regards to all of these people from around the world believing in a narrative that was set by His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid in Dubai and also by the late Sheikh Zayed for the UAE. Believing that vision and flocking from every center of the planet to achieve that vision is indescribable. It's ineffable.
Thank you. Mr. Shamal.
I would say hope. And you might think it's inflated optimism or wishful thinking, but I think when I look back at the 50 years, and the root of the word hope is bend in a direction. the Indo-European root of it. And the UAE has been bending in the direction of growth for youth, for education, for technology, for women empowerment, you name it, in every field, for government. And I think hope is the best word for me to explain the courage of the United Arab Emirates leaders to see reality as it is, but also the audacity to dream of what it could be.
Thank you. Some great words there. And I love the idea of motion, because we are constantly in motion and now looking to the future. Mr. Ahoud, as Minister of the Future, one of your portfolios, I want to ask you, as you build on the last 50 years, what do you see changing in the coming 50?
Well, Mina, 20 days separate us from our Golden Jubilee. And we're really proud of what we have built in the UAE, of building this global hub that's open, tolerant, and evolving. I spent, I think, the last 2 years working on the plan for the next 50 years. And I have to be very honest with you, it was the most challenging, but the most satisfying project that I worked on in my career. When you talk about the next 50 years, it's a long time frame with a lot of unknowns. And it's difficult to foresee that long future with precision from now. But regardless of what the future will hold for us, I think we want to live up to the spirit of our founding fathers' inspiration and vision. Working on two fronts, preserving the soul, the essence of the nation, and strengthening our union. At the same time, keep evolving, building new foundations for the future to unlock the potential of the future. The UAE has just launched its 10 guiding principles for the future. And in essence, these principles are about strengthening our competitive advantage, at the same time pushing the boundaries, expanding into new horizons. And if you allow me, Mina, I would like to talk about five of them very briefly. At the center of the 10 guiding principles is creating the best and most dynamic economy with the aim of building the best quality of life, people living in the UAE. This growth mindset should be at the center of all government institutions, not just the institutions working on the economic sector, but in education, in health, in technology, in youth. You see, new economic models are emerging, new sectors are being created, new trade investment models are shaped, and we would like to be at the center of it. Second, we know that the future is digital, and we aspire to be a digital and scientific power with an ambitious digital and scientific agenda led by my colleagues, Mr. Sarah and Minister Amr. Third, human capital. Human capital is essential for our future, and we continue to work on building our human capital, make them ready for the future. And at the heart of the human capital, we have a special focus on empowering youth so they can reach to their full potential. I have my colleague, Minister Shamma. She's the role model. She's the mentor on that front. It's also very important for us to attract the best talent from around the world by providing them the best opportunities, the best ecosystem, and the best quality of life. And while doing that, it's very important that we preserve the universal Emirati human values of openness, of tolerance, of respect, of human fraternity, and continue being a force for good and peace in our region and the world, supporting other nations, forging future collaborations that are targeting creating a better global future for all of us.
Thank you very much, Minister Ahoud. That's both quite comprehensive, but also quite a tall order. And so, Mr. Umar, I want to turn to you because one of the things Minister Ahoud spoke about is, of course, having the best economy and also a digital economy. And frankly, we're not the only country thinking about that. There are countries around the world thinking about that. What makes the UAE stand out? And how are you preparing, especially when we talk about AI? There's a lot of times that the term is thrown around and people are not actually talking about AI, but also there are then questions about responsible use of AI. How do you bridge that for our audience, our listeners, but also the population here?
Fantastic question. Thank you very much. Let me start by saying this. I think that the whole world right now is trying to compete on a very big pie, but it is a finite race with regards to how much time we have to go to the leadership position of it, just because of the way that money is being thrown at this and how talent is being distributed as well globally. We cannot ever claim to be able to compete with the giants like the US, like China and others. And we are a country that today needs to find our space in a world that is becoming more polarized from an AI perspective. So the first thing that we did was we looked back at our strengths to be able to determine a strategy that will help forecast or shape our future. And our main strength, first and foremost, is the diversity of the people. If we look at AI and we think about the term that's being used, data is the new oil. Yes, for example, China has incredible facial recognition softwares, but the efficiency of those softwares in African countries isn't as good as they are in China, just because of the exposure that these systems get to certain faces, to certain people with certain ethnicities. The same is true, for example, of systems distributed or developed, for example, in other continents like Latin America or Africa or Europe, that are not truly global because they have inherent biases. The first advantage that we have is the 200 nationalities that exist here is one, but the distribution of the nationalities that are existent in the UAE are very unique. So even the local population today as Emiratis, we're just 10%. But there is a plethora of different nationalities, whether it's Europeans, Africans, Indians, Chinese, Americans and others. And that today allows for us to create global systems that are global first. The second is the centralized location of the UAE allows for us to attract the best talent from today markets that are talent exporters. So think about the incredible talents that come out of Russia or Central Europe, the incredible talents that come out of Africa, the incredible talents that come out of India and China as well. How many of those people can go to Europe or the US? Yes, probably at one point of time, Europe and the US were the main pullers or attractors of the brain drain. But today, with different policies that are being put in place, there are opportunities for hubs like the UAE to attract some of the top percentiles of these markets to come and thrive in the UAE. And we're seeing that through the digital economy startups that are becoming, whether it's unicorns or decacorns in the UAE, and also the solutions that are being developed here, they are solutions that are developed by the world, not just by the Emirati population. And then finally, the fact that as a government, we are agile enough to be able to move quickly with the regulation, but also move quickly with either regulating against challenges or regulating for opportunities. That is something that in many other countries will take months or years. It can take weeks or months here. So it's quite different. And we've launched a program called the Reg Lab that allows for great companies and thinkers from around the world to come and actually suggest certain things that should be deployed in the UAE. And we give them 6-month cycles to actually deploy on the ground if we believe that this is not going to harm people, and come back in 6 months and review the impact and the outcome of it. The final thing I think is not related directly to AI, but is a definite advantage, is our geography and our location. We can fly to anywhere in the world in one day, and at the same time you can work in one time zone and access the Asian market in the morning, access the European market in the afternoon, and access the American market all in the same day without having to stay up in the middle of the night and without having to focus on trying to go through things that affect your quality of life to become a global company. So we believe that there are a lot of advantages. We use that to look at first what is our main driver for AI, and the motto that we have for developing AI in the UAE is BRAIN, the acronym BRAIN, building a responsible artificial intelligence nation, because responsible AI means responsible deployment, responsible development, responsible use, and it also means thinking of future generations the same way we're thinking of current generations. It means that we need to also constantly look at the impact and assess them, and then come back to see how we can do better as a country. And that's our advantage. In terms of sectors, we're looking at non-controversial sectors. So oil and gas today is a main source of income for the UAE. How do we optimize to get more dollars for every barrel rather than be affected by price fluctuations? Looking at AI, for example, in logistics, we are a global leader today, and we operate 68 ports around the world. We operate one of the biggest airlines, the busiest airport. How do you use AI not to affect people's privacy, but to increase the efficiency of these services and these systems? And then finally, how do we make the government have efficiency gains by using these technologies? And efficiency gains means that you're not going to deploy something that looks like it's a potential technology that might harm you, but actually do it in a way that people can feel the impact. And that's why when you say, the UAE is the country of the future, it's because you saw the efficiency gain in certain services and you believe it inherently that you're seeing the future and you're seeing the convenience that it creates. Thank you.
Thank you. You've raised so many pointers that I've noted down, I hope we'll be able to come back to, but it's interesting how demographics is mentioned quite often on this panel, and also when we speak in the UAE. Demographics in terms of the variety of people who make the UAE home, but also youth, and always having that idea of we're building for the future generations. What are we doing now that's going to impact future generations? So here I want to turn to Minister Shamma, whose real portfolio is always thinking about these questions, but also ensuring that young people, and mashallah, as we can see on the stage here, young people are integral in decision making, so they actually are agents of change themselves. So I want to ask you, how do young people here view all this change, and how do you see their aspirations for the next 50?
So it's very interesting that 2 weeks ago there was the release of the Arab Burst and Marsteller survey, the Arab Youth Survey of 2021, and we noticed a new kind of narrative that, to me, it's not shocking, but it's optimistic and positive and exciting for all of us. Because if you look back, the Arab Spring, you'll see so much about the voice of youth and their hopes and aspirations not reaching government. Today, data is power, and the survey showed that 100% of Emirati youth believe that their voice matters to government, compared to 72% of Arab youth. Leave the UAE aside, but 72% of Arab youth, this is a big number. I think that is so powerful and profound. Now, what comes after is very important. What happens if their voice is important about government, and how do Arab governments respond? I'll leave that and I'll talk about it in a bit. But how are you dealing with the changes? The other very interesting statistics, and Mina, you wrote an article about it as well when the results came out. It's very shocking to see 60% of Arab youth optimistic that their best days lie in the future. And 90% of Emirati youth say that the best days lie as well in the future, in the next days. So you see so much optimism. Now, the question for governments is, there's a lot of hope among Arab youth now. And if you look at the vice of deficiency of hope, it's hopelessness, which is what we had a few years back in this region, especially that 60% of the region were youth. And the vice of excess is, of course, that inflated optimism. But today, Arab youth's hope is really, one, that their voice matters to government, and governments take action, and they believe that they're the future. So it's very interesting to see this dynamic. When we look deeper into what their aspirations are and what their obstacles are, again, I want to go back to the survey because it's just powerful to see that terrorism is no longer in the list of obstacles facing governments in this region. It was in 2013, 2015, 2016. Today, it's not even on their list. Sustainability is on their list. Climate change is on their list. And so you see that Arab youth are hungry for governments that will invest in them. Maybe Minister Ahoud just mentioned how in the UAE, we really make it a point to ensure that young people are empowered. And not only that their voice is important, but we take action on that voice. So what do we mean by youth empowerment? You might say, well, it's like peace or justice. It's intangible. How do you measure it? Well, this year, my colleague and I really rolled up our sleeves with the Prime Minister's office, and we made this intangible empowerment of youth into something tangible with indicators in our federal government. And it came from young people. What does it mean to have empowered youth? What does it mean to be empowered in your own ministry? Does it mean you're part of youth council? We also have several policies in government that really empower youth. First of all, our youth engagement policy, which is that government entities need to talk to youth in their own language, explain policies, not in kind of this jargon terms. especially AI, et cetera, and we have that. Our youth delegation policy, which is so powerful because we go to so many international kind of conferences, whether it's COP, et cetera, from international organizations, and we never see young people involved. When they're there, sometimes they're just there for a media opportunity. But no, the UAE really wants to include them, and really radical inclusion, and that's radical empowerment. So that's kind of a nutshell of what's happening with Youth and Hope.
Thank you. And those statistics are really important, especially your point about terrorism, because I think sometimes we do get criticized when we talk about what we're doing in the Arab world. Quite often, war and problems and others don't necessarily come into the narrative. But the reason it doesn't is because we're talking about what actually works and what lessons can be taken away from that. And I think that's one of the things that, you know, sometimes we were talking earlier this morning about the gap between the haves and the have-nots, not just as people, but also governments, and it's vision, it's having foresight. And part of that vision is thinking where that economic growth is going to come from, but also that optimism of young people. How do you put it in a world that's changing so quickly? And we, of course, have the famous coined terminology of the fourth industrial revolution that is so important to explain what's happening and the acceleration around us. And so, Minister Sara, I want to turn to you and say, you know, the challenge ahead is making sure that there are those technologies of the fourth industrial revolution that are being harnessed to place strategic decisions and mapping out that future. So if you could kindly tell us, what are those fourth industrial revolution technologies and how they're being utilized?
Absolutely. So first and foremost, I will not talk about technologies because we had an initial dilemma with the creation within the government reshuffle that happened in the Emirates in July of 2020, which was a major retrospective look at how the government functions and how institutions within the government functions in the context of what happened during the pandemic. And one of the ministries that came out of it is the Ministry of Industry and Advanced Technology, being put together in one portfolio. And ourselves, we asked, what does it mean to be in the government sector talking about industry and advanced technology together? And what we've realized, it's not about the technologies. The technologies are what we're used to and what can be deployed in various sectors, but it is the how that's important. How do you deploy those technologies? How do you ensure that those technologies actually work on a shop floor or on a company or within an industry? And it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. You cannot go and take an AI or a VR system or even a production system, even within sectors, and deploy them there. So that's the one factor. Technology, not one-size-fits-all, especially when it comes to the overall terminology or where it operates. The second aspect of it, it's not about the technology. The fourth industrial revolution is about bringing everything together. It's about, if you're talking about industry, it's about the people that work within those industries or within those individual companies. It's about the output, the customers that go into the production process and the output process of the industries. It's about the overall environment. Where do those clusters within the industry operate in, and in which context? Do they operate locally? Do they operate locally and regionally, or do they operate internationally? All of these different aspects feeds into how successful the adoption of technology in existing sectors for the increase of productivity is. So the first aspect that we looked at is understanding where each individual company sits in its adoption of technology process to get towards the fourth industrial revolution, and how that company fits in within its local industry, considering what markets it wants to tap into. And in the larger context of things, where does this industry fit in the long-term development and the sustained development of the UAE's economy? It's through addressing these three different questions are we able to set the future outlook of how governance plays hand in hand with economic growth and development, and hand in hand with technological advancements. And when you move towards technology adoption, you would need to definitely develop technology. Technology adoption, again, is not something that you can take and plug it and play. We're no longer in the second industrial revolution where that works. You're at a point where you need to specialize it, you would need to further design and develop it, you would need to extensively test it prior to deploying it and adopting it. What that opens for us are new sectors within the economy that are based on design and development of technologies. And that's where you can get the second facet of the fourth industrial revolution within the Emirates context that talks about the design and development of technologies in new sectors that feed into the advancement of the other sectors. And as we move forward, the governance aspect comes on, how do you alleviate risk? Transforming from one industrial revolution to another requires a lot of upfront capital from industrial players. And we're talking about this transformation at a time where, like Professor Klaus spoke about, the Great Reset happened. A lot of companies had majorly disrupted their entire business models because of what happened over the course of the last 2 years. How do you alleviate the risk? How do you ensure that access to talent is continuous? And His Excellency Umar spoke about that. How do you ensure that the youth are part of this development aspect and the talent and the capability and the capacity development is continuously being infused to that sector? And how do you ensure that you're agile? Because technology is up and coming and it's transformative and changes a lot. How do you ensure that there is agility in the development process?
Thank you, Minister Sarah. The points you raise, particularly this idea of risk, because Mr. Ahud, you were talking about this kind of long-term and planning for the next 50. We're talking about constant change. We're talking about how young people are seeing their future and building it. But there's also quite a lot of risk involved. And so I want to ask you, how can governments be future ready, taking in all this, the only constant being change? How do you get governments to be future ready?
So, Mina, we have a motto in the UAE that we don't wait for the future, we create it. So having this mindful choice of being proactive rather than reactive summarizes the future readiness mindset in the UAE. Future is a function of speed. And the things are changing at a speed that we never witness in our life. Some people, they say, like, in the next 20 years, the changes will be fourfolds what we're seeing right now. So I think for governments around the world, the future present opportunities, challenges / risks. And I think the approach of governments should be towards future readiness should be multifaceted because future is interconnected, should be multidimensional, and should be also multi-generational, not just focusing on the younger generations because we don't want to leave anyone behind. You see, Mina, things are shifting very quickly for governments. People will live longer, jobs will change, economies will shift, and we're seeing a lot of things in our lifespan in a very short time. And government needs to be ready for that. So if I want to talk about future readiness in governments around the world, I would love to talk about 3 points. So the first and the foremost point is that governments need to build new capabilities in order to address these risks or utilize the opportunities. You know, we have a lot of legacy systems and models that was built in the past 100 years. And these systems need to be reimagined, disrupted, not just improving on them, but having new models and new systems. And let's be frank here. We can't do this by ourselves as governments. We can't. We don't have the answers for everything. Therefore, collaboration is essential. And I will quote Professor Schwab today, future mission-oriented collaborations within governments, across governments, with NGOs, with the scientist community, with the private sector, and the wider community, for us in order to tackle these challenges or opportunities. My second point is about digital, and we said the future is digital. And to stay on the positive side, digital will offer a lot of countries and nations around the world the opportunity to leapfrog and catch up in many domains rather than going through the traditional development trajectory. But also as governments, we need to move from doing things digitally into a digital mindset or a digital being, redesigning every aspect of our business model in a digital way, rather than just doing, but thinking and being digital. We're hearing now discussion about the meta life, where physical blends with the virtual. Are we ready for that? Do we have the systems? Do we have the legislation? What about the policies? So we need to think this through. Also, digital literacy will be very important globally to ensure leaving no one behind. And while the focus on digital will increase, it's critical, Mina, that we don't overlook the human connection in everything that we do as governments. Hence the need for the heart set, the values of empathy, the values of compassion, the values of respect going forward. And my final point is about being future ready, that the best time to create the future is not today, but yesterday. When we started the e-government program in the UAE 21 years ago, there was no pressing need for that. I mean, governments are happy with their papers, archives, and files. But because of that foresight and action 21 years ago, it cemented the resilience of the country during the pandemic. Our government did not stop. Our services did not stop. We started the Smart Learning program 10 years ago, and it met with a lot of speculation because it was disruptive for the nature of the schools. But because of that forward-looking 10 years ago, we were able to shift our schools online immediately. So to conclude, the earlier we start, the readier we'll be. So let's start building the future now.
Thank you very much, Minister Ahoud. And one of the primary people tasked with that, building the future now, or rather yesterday, is Minister Omar. And really, I remember when the United Arab Emirates announced that they would have a Minister of AI, there was a lot of skepticism and said, really, do you need it? And look where we are now, where it's become almost mandatory for any government, but also large corporation to think about that journey of AI and the impact it will have. I want to ask you about the digital economy, because we've talked quite a bit about it. And tell us a bit more about how the UAE is investing in it at home and abroad. But also, Mr. Ahoud made reference to the lessons learned from the pandemic. How do you feel that some of that acceleration and those lessons taken and how you're going about your portfolio today?
Thank you. My job is at one point of time to try to replace myself with an AI. But we'll see how far we can get with that. I'd like to actually start by doing a quick survey in the room. I want to ask who here has bought a cryptocurrency at one point of time over the last couple of years? Okay, so a good amount of people. The reason why I wanted to mention that is because...
Sorry to interrupt you, Minister. So for those who are seeing us online, we'd say about 45% have raised their hands in this
Probably
room?
50%.
50%. Okay, what about the panel? Should we ask government
No,
officials?
I think we'll keep the panel offline.
My hands are firmly down. I don't have that vision. Sorry, please carry on.
So the reason why I asked is because the digital economy is something that today is cutting across many different sectors. We can look at fintech as a part of the digital economy, but even cryptocurrencies as a new trend as part of the digital economy. We can see conventional sectors being reinvented by the digital economy, like, for example, taxi services being reinvented, like Uber, for example, and hotels being reinvented, such as Airbnb. The new way forward, or the new trend that we're going to see moving forward, is that there isn't going to be two economies. We are right now at this inflection point where we can, confidently say conventional economy, digital economy. But at one point of time, in the near future, as the fourth industrial revolution becomes more mainstream, there is only going to be a digital economy, or an economy that is, if it's not purely digital, is enabled by digital means. So we are going through this way forward. I think I am lucky to be a conduit for this in the UAE, trying to push the whole economy forward towards the digital means. Now, what's also important is to go back and reflect on Her Excellency Uhood's point, which is, you can't start this today. And if you do not have the underlying infrastructure, you're already too late. 20 years ago, on October 29th, 2001, right as the internet bubble was popping and the whole world was seeing that the internet was maybe a fad, His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum said that as a government, we're going to bet big on the internet. We're going to build a city for the internet called the Dubai Internet City. We're going to move our government services from traditional, paper-based government services to digital government-based services on the internet. And it was a very bold decision. That creation of a cluster, the attraction of talent, the regulations that were put to regulate the internet, created today a digital economy landscape in the UAE that, if you look at the region, for example, and I'm going to take the worst year, not the best year. This year is the worst year, 2021, compared to previous years. The UAE attracts 63% of all investments in digital economy startups, like FDI, from the region. And most of the companies that cut across geographies in the region, and I'm talking about a region from, let's say, right under Turkey to Uganda and from Morocco to Pakistan, most of the top startups that are regional startups, not just local startups, are coming out of the UAE. So that investment 20 years ago, gave us the current present that we're living in. Moving forward, we need to invest in the infrastructure of the fourth industrial revolution to ensure that we constantly lead this. So there are statistics talking about the impact of 4G on the US economy. And 4G, as some analysts put it, impacted the US economy by around $700 billion, because many of the companies that became billion-dollar unicorns, like Uber and others, were only enabled or only possible because of 4G, because of the convergence of GPS data, internet data, and telecom data coming to one device and allowing for that service to be created. The impact of 5G is going to be in the trillions. We know this. It's going to be one of the most important infrastructure plays in history. And that's why the UAE has bet big on 5G. If you look at the access to 5G today, I think we are amongst the top in the world. And most of the city is 5G enabled. Most of these places are going to be the creation hubs of these companies that create services that are cutting edge and are forward thinking. There's also supercomputing capabilities. Yes, we might not be able to compete with the supercomputers in the US or China, but if you look at computing capabilities to the size of population and the size of country, we are amongst the top in the world. The 26th fastest supercomputer in the world exists in the UAE. It's called Artemis. And the investments in compute capabilities are only increasing. They're not decreasing as we go along. And then finally, when we go back to talent, the thing about this race, the digital economy race, is it's becoming a race that's becoming harder as you go along. So even the leaders are finding it very hard to maintain their leadership position. The only way that you can do this is with talent. And with talent, you have to look at how this talent is able to first gauge the quality of conversation around them. So this group over here is testament that the UAE is moving forward, because the quality of conversations that you have are paramount. I think there's no other place on earth that can have a quality conversation like the people in this room. Imagine if a country is this room on steroids, right? If a whole country, every time you rub shoulders with someone, you can have a very high quality conversation. If you feel like this country is welcoming you, so you can grow roots, you can grow a family, you can develop your business, etc. And if the country as well helps you push your service or your product forward beyond the geography to a broader market. And I think that is our unique selling point, that most of the growth today is coming in Asia, most of the future growth is going to come in Africa, and we're perfectly situated to open up both of these markets for everyone, whether it's scientists, whether it's entrepreneurs, or even people who just want to push the technology forward as technology developers. This is the place to be.
Thank you, Minister Omar. It's always interesting that while we think about the virtual world and digitization and so forth, how important geography is and the physical elements and time zones and the presence of people and the ability to convene are. Mr. Sharma, I want to turn to you. Something that Minister Ahoud said was that this is intergenerational, and we're not just talking about enabling young people, but also making sure that there's an older generation that's on board, and be it through reskilling, be it through digital literacy and so forth. So I want to ask you, and the challenge for young people from a country and a region that is largely young, how can young people be helping society, empowering society, and making sure that there isn't that gap between generations?
I love this question of how can empowered people empower society. Let's look at it if you don't have empowered youth. And if you take physics, energy takes the path of least resistance. So just like water and electricity, if you don't give young people the platform for better jobs, to be educated youth, to be healthy young people, safe, great citizenship, they're going to take the path of least resistance, a path where crime, addiction, terrorism, so many others. And so what kind of society will you have if you had your majority of your population unskilled, unemployed, unhealthy? I think it's a society that no one wants. Now, if you empower young people, what's going to happen? It's smart economics, for sure. But from our perspective in the UAE, and I'll give you a couple of examples, we have a lot of youth councils, so we give young people a seat at the table in every emirate, and they work with the local governments directly to improve their own kind of society. So I'll take two examples. Dubai Youth Council a few weeks ago did two great initiatives. One, to ensure that young people are able to take training programs related to mental health. So we have the national service, and basically for men. And so in every house in the UAE, you have one guy who's basically trained militarily. Right now, our youth council is empowering society by empowering young people to be trained in mental health, to be more resilient, so obstacles make them stronger. Mental health is a very important kind of struggle for young people. That's one example. Another example of improving society, Dubai Youth Council, as well as working with Dubai municipality to make housing regulations and housing policies and kind of the formation of houses more inclusive of people of disabilities. So here you see young people kind of voting for and pushing for more inclusion of others. And that's a society that's more inclusive. That's a society that's going to live in harmony. Another example is from Abu Dhabi, where they're working on sustainability initiatives related to climate change and connecting with nature. And so the possibilities are limitless and endless. There's so much that youth can do and contribute if they are empowered.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shamma. I mean, one of the things that the UAE has really been working towards is how do you get not only young Emiratis, but young Arabs involved more in science and giving them the opportunities to get involved in the sorts of projects that often we see at a distance. And Minister Sara Al-Amiri has many portfolios, but also for many of us know her as the driving force with her team for the UAE Mars probe, which she had to plan for a Mars probe that didn't take into account a pandemic, and yet she still made it happen. It really was something, but it's also this idea of having young Arabs think about being astronauts. We're going to have the first female Arab astronaut from the UAE, hugely important. So I want to ask you about that, how that gives the region's young people hope, but also, the challenges that you must face and make sure that this is beyond, just beyond the few who get the best education. How do you empower a greater sector of society?
So first is with inclusion and ensuring that you have access to these opportunities and these programs that allows you to work on it. And what that does inadvertently is it allows you to normalize it. Growing up, I never ever would have imagined or aspired to or even thought possible for me to work on a mission to Mars, let alone to a spacecraft around Earth. It was something that was completely not plausible, and no amount of education and no amount of aspiration would have made that possible for me. That's in my thinking. This is sort of the realm that I lived in and that I grew up in. A lot of it was in my mind, but at the end of the day, a child's mind is shaped with the world around them. And the realm of opportunity is what you emulate in the world around you. And creating this window of opportunity for an entire region to make what we colloquially refer to as the hardest thing to do, going into space, sending a spacecraft to another planet, exploring the greatest unknown. And it's through this window of opportunity that you start getting dialogue into the changes that we all spoke about, into creating the necessary opportunities, into normalizing that working on designing and developing very complex technological systems that are risky, chances of failure are 50%, that are inadvertently difficult to do, that you don't have all the necessary skills to do, but you're going to learn along the way. That creates an interesting shift in concept and perception. And we see that in our workforce today. We see that in the region on what is possible in our dialogues that we're hearing from so many different countries that want to, one, talk about the UAE's model of developing such a complex industry, which is the space industry, and how they can create that necessary impact within their industries. But it allowed us to open up a global dialogue on how the UAE can further solidify itself as one of the space players and the space industrial players globally and create the necessary impact there. And again, creating opportunities for the region. We do have a spacecraft that's currently in development called 813 with members from the Arab community around the region working on the design and development of that satellite. And as we move forward from exploring Mars to exploring the asteroid belt, which is our upcoming mission, what underlines that is tapping into an industry that we know has expanded and developed quite rapidly and allows for someone from the region to become a player in it. And it factors into urban development, it factors into climate change, it uplifts your entire society, and the benefits of it is impacting exploration and the plight of knowledge.
Thank you. So space is one of those sectors where really you're seeing much, much more public-private partnership, but also more private money going into what previously was just government sector or seen as the public sector. So as we start to wrap up our conversation, I want to talk about public-private partnerships, partly because this is really a panel at the World Economic Forum, so we would be remiss not to, but also because this is a conversation that is being represented from the government. So it'd be great to see your thinking about what is one strategic public-private partnership that you think could move the needle on the many changes that we've discussed. So Minister Ahud, I'm going to start with you.
So Mina, if you allow me, I will not talk about the one public-private partnership, but what I want to say that we need to reimagine this partnership. I mean, each government around the world, they have an office somewhere called public-private partnership. I think last time I checked, there were 200 of them. But with my honest opinion, they did not deliver to the expectations of governments or the private sector or the people they're serving. So my calling for governments around the world is to revamp this notion of public-private partnerships, shifting it from just PPP into FP, which I would call the future partnerships, with a specific mission towards creating the future and expanding beyond just the private sector to the whole of society, the whole of community, because we can't play solo when it comes to the future. We need to be united, united in our responsibility, united in our accountability, and united in our action.
It's interesting you raise the point of accountability, because I think this is one of the questions people sometimes have. If it's the private sector getting involved, for example, in space, they say, but hold on, who are they accountable to? But also on governments, accountability really being, and what we've seen in the pandemic, based on legitimacy through competence. So that competence point that you raised, that, you know, if we're talking about PPP, well, actually, how competent were these partnerships and how did they deliver? So that measurement is hugely important. Minister Sarah, I'll turn to you next.
I'll speak to the public-private partnership from the context of one of the methods. And the reason I'm going to refer to one of the methods is because it's not a public-private partnerships that is typical, like you said, a PPP. And there's only one model to work towards it. In, for example, the fourth industrial revolution, most industries especially the biggest players within the Emirates that are both made up from multinational and UAE-based companies, understand that we will enter into the fourth industrial revolution as an economy when the entire industry enters into it. So it's no longer a single company that needs to operate as a lighthouse, as an example. It is the entire industry and the ecosystem around it that needs to operate at that level for you to realize as an economy the benefits of the fourth industrial revolution. And through this, we've created the Champions Network, where we have over 12 of the top adopters of fourth industrial revolution or developers of fourth industrial revolution technologies that are part of uplifting their entire sector through transferring know-how, through transferring experiences, through bringing in what is the right practice to adopting technologies, and some of them even offering free digital transformation for some companies that are working in their sector. So it's no longer about competition between public-private partnerships, and it's expanding into public-private partnerships. Because we all realize collectively that if you uplift an economy, you need to uplift it together. If you want to create a more interconnected nation, you need to do it together. If you want to have better governance of any sector, or better opportunities created within the sectors, you need to do it together. That doesn't remove the opportunity for partnership, but that allows you to create a better environment by which you can operate in and create the right competition that then advances, in my sector, technological advancement forward rather than being antagonistic to joint development.
It's really interesting, because then how do you, if you're helping to elevate the sector as a company, you're helping other competitors. So how do you bring the competition, maintain the competition, while also elevating the sector?
So competition is actually healthy for technological advancement. If it's only a single company that designs and develops technologies, you need to rely on the internal workings of that institution to ensure that technologies are not only incrementally being tweaked, but rather the monumental shifts that you need to see is moving forward. When you have competition, and it's not necessarily direct competition, one-to-one product and service competition, they're usually complementary because we're at a time where personalization is in place. Therefore, you're able to create the necessary competition to, one, ensure that companies are moving forward in their development and it's not incremental changes in technologies, and at the same time allowing market access. And the way we do it within the country is ensuring that we're expanding market access for these companies. So once you're elevating them, you're increasing their access to market, ensuring their long-term competitiveness, because as any country wants, we need to ensure that every sector of our economy can sustain itself, not during the 5 years that is important for the bottom line, but for the 10, 15 years that ensures the resilience of your overall economy. And to be able to do that, you need to accept, yes, competition is there, complementary competition is there, opening up market is there. And it's a multifaceted approach that you can take to elevating the entire sector.
Thank you very much. Minister Omar.
So by public, we mean government, right?
Yes.
So that's the conventional term. I think that that's probably a historic term that is no longer relevant because it depends on where it's being used. Because the government does not always represent directly what the ambitions of the people want on specific fields, right? It might be how it's affecting the government directly. So I think we need to bring the people into the mix. So just to add another acronym here, we should look at it as public-private people partnership, right? We need to bring the people into the loop. The second thing is, depending on what we are approaching and how we're approaching it, that order changes. So if you look at climate change, for example, it's a people, public-private partnership. Because if the people on the ground do not take the actions, government officials talk about it a lot. We've seen that. We've seen the maximum cap of 2 degrees and all of the different goals that were put in place. Achieving that will not happen if each and every single one of us does not take a small action that is going to lead to big change. And COVID was a great example where a lot of the natural environment got affected by us taking decisions of not leaving our houses, not traveling, not doing certain things. So on that specific example, it's people, public, private partnerships. On other examples where the technology or the issue at hand is not at the, let's say, periphery of governments. If we look at today a hypothetical technology of something like Pico technology, for example, right? It's not on any government's agenda. It's not on anyone's mind. Here it should be private, public, people partnership. The private sector, if it is developing something on that front and if it has achieved a breakthrough, should engage on these discussions, should bring the government up to speed, should increase awareness when it comes to people, and should try to nurture the right partnerships that will instill change and move things forward and push the envelope forward. And then finally, on items or issues specifically facing government. So if we look at what Her Excellency Shamma said on, for example, the youth feeling like their voice is not heard or the government not being able to provide the right platform, here the government shouldn't be worried about actually engaging. You know, the government should bring the private sector, should bring the people, and should try to engage actively to try to overcome the challenge, because no one is going to blame you for trying. What they're going to blame you for is not doing anything. And I think depending on the order of these three and depending on the task that is being addressed, the way that its approach should change.
Thank you. I love this idea of inaction in itself is a problem, and that you will be criticized without the intent and the will. So, Minister Shamma, to you, what is the one or multiple strategic public-partner partnerships you think the world should be capitalizing on?
So in my field and in the youth field, I think one of the most important topics is skills, and we've seen kind of public-private partnerships a bit failing. If you look at the global talent shortage, it's 40 million workers, yet a shortage of 40 million skilled workers, yet we have so much unemployment. Where is that? Why aren't we solving it? And I think I just want to touch on Mr. Oud and Mr. Umar's viewpoint on how can we reframe and redefine PPEs or future partnerships or adding people, public-private partnerships. I think the way sometimes we're approaching public and private partnership is a zero-sum game sometimes, and not seeing it as a win-win. And sometimes we see it as 1 + 1 = 2. We all learned arithmetics, yes, 1 + 1 = 2, but I think these partnerships need to be 1 + 1 more than 2. And we see it in nature. Nature teaches us the power of synergy. If you look at plants, two plants alone will grow on themselves, but when they're kind of intertwined, if their roots were intertwined together, they will grow stronger plants. Take 2 blocks of wood, it's one wood and another wood, and put them together, they will carry more than what they can carry on themselves. That's more than 2. There's so many maybe examples anyone can think of, but I think why don't we approach public-private partnerships with that kind of lens of that, hey, we can do so much more when we really believe that it's a win-win situation and not a zero-sum game.